The doctor didn't look up when he said the words, as if detaching from them made them less brutal. But the syllables came anyway, slow, quiet, irreversible. And Ava heard them like the tearing of fabric too tightly stretched. Time of death, 3:42 a.m. And just like that, the last person who truly saw her, the one who never needed her to explain her silence or hide her sadness, was gone forever. The room didn't scream or collapse around her like in the movies. It just stood there, sterile and motionless, a cruel witness to a sacred ending. And Ava didn't move either. Her feet locked in place as her mother's chest stilled for the last time beneath a pale hospital blanket. No final words. No miracle moment. Just an absence that hit like a hammer to the heart. She wanted to cry but couldn't. Wanted to scream but choked instead on a grief so thick it strangled every thought in her head except for one. This can't be how it ends. The machine stopped beeping, but something kept ringing in her ears, some internal siren sounding the end of everything she knew. And as a nurse reached out with some empty gesture of condolence, Ava stepped back like touch. Itself was betrayal. Her legs carried her to the parking lot, but she didn't remember walking there. Her mother's coat was still draped over her arm, her fingers still clutching the bag of snacks they never got to eat during what they'd both hoped would be a short stay. The car was too quiet, too cold, and as the rain began to fall in light taps on the windshield, she sat behind the wheel, unmoving for an hour. Her body present, but her soul elsewhere. Lost in the void her mother left behind. Back at the house, the walls seemed too wide. Like her mother's presence had once filled them to their edges, and now the space echoed with an unbearable emptiness. The tea kettle still had water in it. Her reading glasses still sat on the end table. The devotional was still open to yesterday's page, the corner folded in the way she always did. Ava didn't touch any of it. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, as if holding her own body was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She didn't pray that night. She didn't even try. What could she say to a God who had gone silent when she had begged? What words could possibly pass through the lump in her throat, the fire in her chest, the betrayal in her bones? The Bible on the shelf mocked her, its leather cover untouched for weeks, and the cross on the wall felt less like hope and more like irony, like an emblem of promises unkept. People sent texts. She's in a better place. You'll see her again. God has a plan. Ava left them unread. At the funeral, she nodded through the service like a puppet, blinked through eulogies she couldn't process, shook hands with people who quoted scripture like it was anesthesia, like if they said the right verse it would dull the pain, but none of it worked. Ava had always believed, or at least wanted to. But now, belief felt like a game she didn't know the rules to anymore. Days passed, but she didn't. She stopped going to church. She ignored Elisa's calls. She skipped meals. She didn't speak to God, not because she didn't think he existed, but because she didn't think he cared. And if he did, why didn't he intervene? Why let her mother die after all those prayers? Why let her be the one to find the room empty, the hand cold, the goodbye missed? Sometimes she'd walk into her mother's room and just sit there, watching the dust dance in the sunlight, wondering if maybe God had died too. Maybe he'd stopped listening a long time ago and she'd just now noticed. The silence wasn't just spiritual, it was cellular, like her very soul had gone mute. And that terrified her. One night she tried to pray, but all that came out was a breath and a sob, and that was it. No words, no eloquence. Just a sound too broken to be anything holy. She curled up on the couch with her mother's blanket pulled over her shoulders and stared at the wall until morning, her thoughts looping endlessly. Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you answer? The world moved on around her. Cars passed by, birds sang, deliveries came. But Ava remained frozen in that same moment of loss, unable to bridge the space between her pain and the God who once felt near. Weeks passed before she dared to open the nightstand drawer, where her mother kept things Ava never paid attention to. Old cards, prayer notes, and folded-up scriptures scribbled on napkins and post-its. There, at the bottom, under a yellowed church bulletin, she found an envelope with her name on it, written in her mother's soft cursive, slightly tilted like it always was. Ava's breath caught. Her hands shook. She sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope, unopened in her lap, a war raging inside her. Do I want to read this? What if it makes it worse? What if it's all just more verses I don't believe in anymore? But something kept her there. Something held her in place, like a gentle hand on her shoulder. And before she could open the letter, a whisper formed in her spirit. Not a voice, not a sentence, just a whisper of truth that didn't come from her. Even your silence is not empty. She didn't understand it, but it quieted something inside her. And she stayed sitting there, the letter unopened, her hands over her face, not praying, not speaking, just breathing. Wordless, but heard. Silent, but not alone. And though she couldn't name it yet, something eternal had just stepped into the room. The days blurred together in a fog of dishes left unwashed, voicemail notifications ignored, and unopened mail piling by the front door like guilt wrapped in envelopes. And Ava moved through them like a ghost wearing her own skin. A version of herself that existed only to breathe, eat something when she remembered, and avoid anything sacred. Sleep became an enemy, dragging her into dreams of her mother's face, sometimes smiling, sometimes coughing, sometimes silent. And every time she woke gasping, it felt like losing her all over again. The Bible remained untouched on the nightstand like a closed door she no longer had the key for, and each time she walked past it, she looked away, like eye contact with it might demand something of her she couldn't give. The envelope with her name written on it sat unopened on her dresser like a landmine she was too scared to defuse. Every day she considered reading it, and every day she chickened out, convinced it would either be a farewell she wasn't ready for, or another verse that would fail her like all the others had. The guilt was worst in the morning, when the world felt clean, and she still felt dirty, when sunlight filtered through the curtains like mercy she hadn't earned, and she'd lie still, hollow and ashamed, wondering how she had let her faith rot like this. Elise kept texting. Little check-ins Ava didn't answer. Thinking of you today. No pressure, but I'm here. I left something for you on the porch. One day, after nearly tripping over the package Elise had dropped off, Ava brought it inside without thinking, peeled back the paper, and found a tin of chamomile tea and a small notebook titled, Even When You Can't Speak, a journal for the wordless. The cover alone made her throat close. Inside were blank pages with faint prompts. Today, I wish I could tell God. Or, if I believed he heard me, I'd say. And Ava threw it on the counter like it had burned her, her heart pounding in defiance because she didn't want a bridge back to faith. She wanted a reason to stay away. That night, she sat on the kitchen floor with the tea untouched beside her, scrolling through old photos of her mother on her phone until one caught her off guard. Her mom laughing at a church potluck, holding a casserole dish, and wearing an apron that said, Holy, holy, holy lasagna. Ava snorted through her tears, the sound catching in her throat like a rusty hinge. She could almost hear her mom's voice. You laugh now, but you loved that lasagna. And for the first time in weeks, the pain didn't feel like a knife, just a bruise. The next morning, she cracked the journal open. Just one page, just one sentence. She wrote, "I don't know what I believe right now, but I miss her." Then closed it quickly, ashamed, but also strangely relieved. It was something. A whisper into a void that might still be listening. Encouraged but unsure, she walked into her mother's old sewing room again, running her hand over the unfinished quilt on the chair, and noticed something she hadn't before. A small card tucked under the fabric with a note that said, "Finish this for someone who needs it." Ava stared at it, stunned. Was this a coincidence or one of her mother's prophetic kindnesses? Her mom had always believed God spoke through small acts, through gestures that looked ordinary until you realized they were grace in disguise. Ava sat down and ran her hand across the patterned pieces. She didn't know how to sew, but something inside her whispered, "Try." She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just a way to feel close to her mother, or maybe it was something more. But she threaded the needle and began slowly, clumsily, working the stitches together like a broken language she was learning to speak. That afternoon, Elise called again, and this time Ava picked up. Her voice cracked when she said hello, and Elise didn't speak right away. Just breathed into the line like silence could be sacred too. "I've been praying," Elise finally said. "Not for answers, just that you'd feel him again, even a little." Ava didn't know how to respond. She wanted to say, "I haven't prayed in weeks," but instead she said, "I found something she left behind." And that was enough. They agreed to meet at the park where Ava used to walk with her mom on Sunday afternoons. The bench was still there, the one with the little brass plaque that said, "In memory of those we carry in our hearts." Elise brought 2 cups of hot cider and a box of tissues. They talked about silly things at first. How her mom once tried to baptize the neighbor's cat when she thought it was possessed. How she always cried during Little House on the Prairie. How she said, "Oh mercy," instead of swearing even when she stubbed her toe. Then the conversation quieted, and Elise reached into her bag and handed Ava a folded paper. "This was in my devotion yesterday," she said. "It's not one I usually remember, but I think it's for you." Ava took it, hands hesitant, eyes brimming, and unfolded it slowly. The verse was short, underlined in pen. "In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans." Romans 8:26. Ava froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes scanned the verse again, and something inside her cracked, not broken this time, but open. She looked at Elise, whispering, "I haven't been able to say anything to God." Elise nodded. "That's okay. He already knows. He hears you anyway." Ava blinked fast, trying not to cry, but it was too late. The dam burst. And there on that bench, cider cooling in her lap, wind tugging at the sleeve of her sweater, Ava wept. Not just for her mother, not just for the weeks of silence, but because for the first time she realized she hadn't been abandoned. Her groans, her breathless sobs, her wordless pain. It had all been prayer. The Spirit had been translating her ache the entire time. She hadn't been mute in heaven's ears. She had been heard. That night, she lit a candle in her mother's room, held the letter again, and whispered into the stillness, "I think I'm ready to read what you left me." Her hands didn't shake this time. Her tears were soft, not desperate. And as she opened the envelope and began to read, a warmth spread through her chest. Not a fire, but a quiet glow. like the light of something returning. The words were short, simple, powerful. Sweetheart, when you can't speak, God still listens. When you don't have words, the Spirit speaks for you. I prayed Romans 8:26 over you your whole life, and I trust He'll carry you, even now. Ava clutched the letter to her heart and didn't say a word, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. The silence had become sacred again, and in it she finally knew she was not alone. A week after reading her mother's letter, Ava found herself standing outside the little white church where they used to sit in the second pew from the front, her hands buried in the pockets of her coat and her heart pounding with the kind of nervousness usually reserved for funerals and first dates, because coming back here meant facing more than just memories. It meant confronting everything she had avoided since the day her world unraveled. She hadn't stepped inside since the funeral, hadn't even driven down this street. But now something pulled her here, a whisper in her spirit that had grown louder every day since she read that verse in Romans, the one that cracked open the silence and showed her she had never truly been voiceless. She walked through the doors slowly, the smell of old hymnals and lemon oil filling her lungs like a forgotten language, and was startled by how small it felt. This sacred space that once held her childhood, her baptism, her mother's laughter echoing off the stained glass windows. The sanctuary was empty, except for Pastor John, who sat near the altar holding a Bible in his lap and looking every bit as surprised to see her as she was to be seen. He stood slowly, offering a warm, tentative smile, and said, "It's good to see you again, Ava," like he didn't want to scare her away. She didn't sit at first. She wandered the rows, her fingers trailing along the backs of the pews, her eyes scanning the room like it might hold pieces of her mother hidden in the corners. She sat right there, every Sunday. Pastor John said gently, pointing to the third pew on the left. Even when she was tired, even when her back hurt. Ava nodded, her throat tight, and whispered, "She prayed a lot for me, didn't she?" And he smiled with a kind of sadness that was also reverence. Every week, without fail, and not just prayers of worry, prayers of trust. She always said, "Even when Ava can't pray, I know the Spirit is doing it for her." Ava sat down slowly in her mother's spot, and the tears came instantly, not violent like before, but soft and steady, like rain that knew it was watering something. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know she believed like that." Pastor John didn't interrupt her grief. He waited, and when she looked up, he said, "Ava, your mother's faith was deep, but it wasn't blind. She knew about silence. She knew what it meant to feel abandoned, but she also knew what it meant to trust that God was still listening, even to groans." The words hit hard. Groans. Wordless. Holy. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out the letter, unfolding it with trembling hands and reading it again, right there in the pew. And this time the words felt different, fuller, like they had grown in meaning, because now she believed them, even if only a little. "Why didn't she tell me she was sick again?" Ava asked, voice cracking. "Why didn't she prepare me?" Pastor John sighed, his eyes heavy with something unspoken, and then he said, "Because she didn't want you to carry that burden. She told me she was ready to go, but she prayed you would still live." The truth stunned Ava. It knocked the breath out of her lungs. Her mother knew she was dying, and she didn't say anything, not to protect her, not to spare her the grief. Ava's fists clenched. "That's not fair," she said. "I should have had the chance to say goodbye. I should have gotten to hold her hand and tell her I loved her one more time." Pastor John nodded. "I know. And she knew you'd feel that way. But she told me that her love for you wasn't bound by a final conversation. It was in every prayer, every touch, every word she poured into you. She said, "If Ava doesn't get to say goodbye, I hope she still feels me close every time she breathes in grace." Ava doubled over in the pew, the grief now a living thing writhing in her chest, and Pastor John knelt beside her, not with answers, but with presence. "Ava," he said gently, "grief is not a punishment. It's proof that you loved deeply. And silence doesn't mean God left. It just means he was weeping with you." That night, Ava drove home in silence, not the aching kind she had come to know, but a quieter, sacred kind, the kind that feels like reverence. She sat on the couch and looked through her mother's prayer journal again, page after page filled with Ava's name written in different colors, different moods. Ava's exam today. Ava's heart feels heavy. Ava's future is in your hands. Near the back, she found a page dated just weeks before her mother passed. It read, "Lord, if my voice fails, let your spirit speak for me. And if Ava can't pray, hold her in my place." Ava wept like a child, like the daughter she still was, clutching that journal to her chest, like an heirloom of sacred intimacy. And then, slowly, she walked into her bedroom and pulled out the sewing box she had nearly thrown away. She took the quilt from the chair, stitched just barely into being, and spread it across her lap, her fingers trembling as they touched each square her mother had chosen with care. It wasn't finished. It didn't need to be. She finally understood that healing didn't mean completion. It meant continuing, even with the torn pieces. She whispered a single sentence, the first real prayer she had formed since her mother died. "God, if you're still here, teach me to speak again." No thunder came, no vision, just peace, stillness. A sacred hum inside her soul that felt like breath returning to a place long collapsed. And in that holy quiet, she felt it, the truth she had run from, that God had never left, that her grief was never invisible, and that even when she had no words, he had never stopped listening. It wasn't just Romans 8:26, it was her entire story. Every wordless sob, every silent tear, every groan of longing had already been heard in the language of heaven. That night, she placed the unfinished quilt over her shoulders like a mantle, picked up the journal again, and began to write. Not because she had the words, but because she finally understood that the attempt was enough. The Spirit would fill the rest. Ava didn't return to church the next week, not out of defiance, but because she had discovered something quieter and just as holy in her own home, in the slow, hushed spaces where grief no longer screamed and faith didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. She started each morning by lighting a single candle on the windowsill, not to perform a ritual, but to remind herself that light still had permission to exist, even in the shadow of loss. The quilt remained unfinished, but rested on her shoulders like armor stitched from memory and mercy, and she began to wear it while she journaled. Each entry less about questions now and more about reflection. A quiet unfolding of peace that didn't erase the pain, but began to soften its edges. She found herself sitting for long stretches without writing at all, just watching the trees sway outside the window, her fingers resting on the open pages of her mother's Bible. The familiar verse from Romans now underlined in gentle blue ink, as if even the mark itself knew it needed to be soft. One morning, as she steeped tea in her mother's old mug, Ava noticed the silence in the house had changed. Where it used to feel heavy and abandoned, it now felt alive, like something sacred had taken up residence in the stillness, whispering comfort she couldn't explain. She didn't talk much during these hours. She didn't need to. Prayer had become less about forming perfect words and more about presence, about showing up to the silence and letting God meet her there, whether through scripture, memory, or breath. One afternoon, Elise stopped by with a tray of scones and a book she thought Ava might like. But instead of their usual back and forth, they sat on the porch together in quiet companionship, the kind that doesn't need to fill the air with noise to prove connection. After a while, Elise said, "I think she'd be proud of you." And Ava didn't answer with words. She just smiled, eyes closed, heart still. That night, Ava walked into her father's den for the first time since the funeral, finding him sitting in the dark watching an old home video of her mother singing to a baby Ava in the nursery, her voice off-key but full of joy. He didn't pause the video when she entered. He just looked at her with tear-glossed eyes and said, "I thought I'd be stronger than this." And she sat beside him, gently resting her head on his shoulder, whispering, "I thought I'd never feel anything again." And they wept together, no longer alone in their silence. In the following days, Ava found herself drawn to the community her mother had quietly cultivated. The older women's prayer circle, the volunteer board at church, even the crocheted baby blankets in the donation box her mother used to fill. She didn't volunteer or lead or preach. She just listened, sitting in the back of the room like a witness to the legacy of love her mother had sown. One of the women handed her a folded note one day after a prayer gathering. It was from her mother, apparently written weeks before she passed and left in the group's journal. "If Ava finds this, remind her that silence can be sacred. Remind her that even groans are heard. Remind her that when she can't lift her hands, we'll be lifting them for her." Ava didn't cry this time. She simply bowed her head and whispered, "Thank you." And it felt like both a prayer to God and a thank you note to her mother. As summer edged into fall, Ava started walking every morning, just 30 minutes through the neighborhood where she used to walk with her mom, past the roses she always stopped to smell, past the library where she volunteered, past the house with the bird bath she used to refill even though it wasn't hers. These walks became sacred rhythms, each step a kind of prayer, each breath a wordless psalm. She passed a young woman sitting on the curb one day, crying quietly into her hands, and instead of walking by, Ava sat beside her, offering a packet of tissues and saying only, "You don't have to explain. I've been there." The girl looked at her with wide, stunned eyes, as if Ava had just spoken her language. And Ava realized then that her silence had become a form of ministry, not the platform kind, but the presence kind. Her grief hadn't disqualified her. It had initiated her into a sacred fellowship of the brokenhearted. That evening, Ava sat on her mother's porch swing and watched the sun dip below the trees, the sky painted in soft purples and golds, and she remembered how her mom used to say, "God speaks in colors, too." She laughed quietly, and then stilled, feeling something inside her shift. Not a dramatic moment, not a thunderous revelation, but the click of understanding falling into place like a puzzle piece she didn't know was missing. The Spirit hadn't just been interceding. For her, He had been dwelling within her, shaping her silence into sacred groans, shaping her grief into wisdom, shaping her wounds into witness. And for the first time, Ava felt not just healed, but trusted, like God had trusted her with the pain, trusted her to carry it not as punishment, but as proof of love too deep to die. That night, she picked up the journal again, opened to a fresh page, and wrote, "I am learning to be still. I am learning to be sacred in silence. I am learning that God speaks even when I don't. Then she closed the book and stared at the ceiling, tears rolling gently down her cheeks. Not grief this time, but release. But not everything was finished. Not yet. The sewing machine in her mother's room still sat untouched, and the last square of the quilt remained folded in a drawer she hadn't opened. It waited, patiently, lovingly, like the final thread of the story still needed to be sewn in. And Ava knew with quiet certainty that its time would come. The morning she decided to finish the quilt, Ava didn't light a candle or put on worship music or perform any quiet rituals. She simply sat down, exhaled, and threaded the needle. Not as an act of closure, but as a quiet declaration. This grief did not win, and this silence was not wasted. The final square had been waiting in a drawer for months, folded with a note in her mother's handwriting. For the end, use the fabric from your baptism dress. The sight of it made her pause, made her cry, made her smile all at once, because it reminded her that even in dying, her mother had been preparing for resurrection. Not the kind that empties graves, but the kind that awakens the living. Stitch by stitch, Ava pieced it in, not perfectly, but faithfully. The lines slightly crooked, the corners not quite aligned. But it was hers now, a joint effort across time and heaven and spirit. When she finished, she wrapped it around her shoulders and stood by the mirror, not to admire the quilt, but to see who she had become. Not the girl who couldn't pray, not the daughter frozen in grief, but the woman who had walked with sorrow and survived. That Sunday, she returned to church, not to perform, not to please, but to sit quietly in the pew her mother once occupied. The quilt folded beside her like a prayer too big for words. The sanctuary was fuller than she remembered. Or maybe it was just that her heart had reopened enough to notice again. Elise waved from across the room, her smile soft and proud. During the service, the pastor read from Romans 8. Not the part Ava had clung to for weeks, but a few verses later. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Ava didn't flinch this time. She didn't roll her eyes. She closed them, let the words wash over her, and whispered internally, "Even this." After the service, a young woman approached her, a newcomer, eyes red-rimmed, voice trembling as she said, "I don't know why I'm here today. I've lost someone and I haven't prayed in weeks." Ava didn't offer advice. She didn't quote scripture. She took the girl's hand and said, "That's okay. God hears you anyway. Even your silence is sacred." The girl's eyes filled with tears, and Ava pulled her into an embrace, the kind that says, "Me too," without needing to say anything. That evening, Ava visited her mother's grave alone, the finished quilt tucked under her arm, and sat beside the headstone with the kind of peace that no longer demanded answers. The grass had grown tall, soft around the edges, and the sky above stretched wide with dusk, streaked with gold and blue like a final benediction. She laid the quilt across her lap and began to read aloud the letter her mother had left her. This time, not with tears, but with reverence. As if the words had bloomed into their full meaning only now, months later, on this sacred ground. She read slowly, letting the silence linger between each sentence, trusting that the Spirit still translated the pauses. When she reached the end, she folded the letter back into its envelope, kissed the edge like she used to kiss her mother's cheek, and said softly, "I'm okay now. Not perfect, not whole, but okay." As the sun dipped behind the trees, Ava looked up and whispered, "Thank you for staying, even when I didn't speak." And though no audible voice answered, she felt the reply deep in her chest. The warmth, the stillness, the knowing. In the days that followed, Ava didn't become a preacher or a counselor. She simply became present. To her father, who now let her hold his hand during the quiet parts of the movie. To Elise, who sometimes cried more freely because she knew Ava could hold it. To strangers in grief groups who found themselves telling her things they hadn't told anyone. Her silence had become sanctuary. Her sorrow had become testimony. And slowly, she began writing letters, short ones, to people who had lost loved ones, to people who hadn't prayed in years, to people who were sitting in pews and pretending to sing. She never signed them. She only wrote a single line at the end of each. Even when you can't speak, God is still listening. Romans 8:26. One day she walked into the church early and placed her quilt over the back of her mother's pew. No one sat there that morning. But later that week she heard that a woman new to town had found it and wrapped it around her during a grief support meeting. Ava smiled when she heard. It wasn't hers anymore. It had always been bigger than her. And as she lit a candle that night in the same window, the final words of her mother's voice echoed gently in her spirit. Not a command, not a lesson, just this. You prayed, Ava. Every tear, every breath. The Spirit knew, and that was enough.